The grandfather clock in the Brennan house had kept perfect time for 137 years, its brass pendulum swinging with the steady precision of a heartbeat. Until the afternoon that David Brennan told his wife he was working late, and the mechanism stopped mid-swing. The silence so sudden and complete, it felt like the house itself had stopped breathing. Caroline stood in the hallway, staring at the frozen hands, 4:17 p.m., while her husband's car pulled out of the driveway, not heading toward his office downtown, but turning left toward the highway, toward wherever people go when they're lying to the person they promised to tell the truth to forever. She waited for the clock to start again, thinking maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the ancient mechanism had simply chosen that moment to fail. But even as she thought it, she knew better, because the Brennan family had always known what the clock was, what it did, how it judged them with its silence whenever the truth bent just far enough to break. The clock had arrived with Caroline's great-great-grandfather, Elias Brennan, in 1888, shipped from Germany, where it had been built by a clockmaker whose name had been lost to time, but whose reputation for creating timepieces of unusual accuracy had been legendary. Family lore said the clockmaker had been obsessed with truth, had believed that lies corrupted the very flow of time itself, and had somehow built that belief into the mechanisms of his clocks, springs and gears that could detect falsehood the way a compass detects magnetic north. Caroline had grown up with the clock, had learned early that certain things couldn't be said in its presence. Small lies, "I'm fine," "I didn't eat the last cookie," "I finished my homework," would cause it to stutter, skip a beat, the rhythm faltering for a moment before recovering. But bigger lies, lies that mattered, lies that changed things, those stopped it completely. She'd been 12 when her father had an affair. The clock had stopped on a Tuesday evening when he told her mother he was going to a conference. It had stayed stopped for 3 days, until he'd confessed, until the truth had been spoken aloud, and the weight of deception had lifted enough for time to resume its march. She'd been 17 when her brother died. Car accident, the police said. Drunk driving. But the clock had stopped the moment the officer said it, had stayed frozen at 11:43 p.m., and Caroline had known with the terrible certainty the clock provided that it wasn't true. Her brother didn't drink. Someone had lied about what happened that night, and the clock wouldn't move until the real truth came out. It took 6 months. An investigation, a witness finally coming forward, a confession from the other driver who'd run the red light and fled the scene, and let Caroline's brother take the blame posthumously. The clock started again the moment the man admitted what he'd done, even though he was 3 states away and had no connection to the Brennan house or the clock inside it. Some truths, Caroline had learned, resonated beyond their speaking. Some lies stopped time itself. When she'd married David 7 years ago, she'd warned him about the clock. He'd laughed, charmed by what he thought was a quirky family superstition. "So I just have to always tell you the truth? That's easy. I love you. I'll never lie to you." The clock had kept perfect time on their wedding day, but now it was stopped, and David was gone, and Caroline stood in the hallway of their old Victorian house in the small town of Ashfield, Massachusetts, wondering what lie had just been told and what truth was about to shatter her life. She tried to wind the clock. The key turned, but nothing happened. The pendulum hung motionless. The hand stayed frozen at 4:17. She remembered her father telling her once, "The clock doesn't care about your wants. It only cares about truth. Until the lie is corrected, time stands still for liars." Caroline called David's office. His secretary, a young woman named Jennifer, who always sounded slightly flustered, said David had left early, said he had a family emergency. "What family emergency?" Caroline asked, her voice steady despite the cold spreading through her chest. "He didn't say. He just seemed upset. Is everything okay?" Caroline hung up without answering. She looked at the clock again, at those frozen hands, and made a decision. If David had lied, if he'd stopped time with his deception, then she would find out what truth he was hiding. She started with the obvious places. His home office, neat and organized, showed nothing unusual. His computer was password protected, but she knew the password, their anniversary. She found nothing suspicious in his emails, his browsing history, his files. Whatever he was hiding it well. She moved to his dresser, his closet, feeling like an intruder in her own home. In the back of his sock drawer, she found an envelope. Inside were photographs, old ones from before they'd met. David as a younger man, maybe 25, with his arm around a woman Caroline didn't recognize. They looked happy, in love, standing in front of a house that wasn't this house, in a town that wasn't this town. On the back of one photo, in David's handwriting, Emma and me, 2011, before everything went wrong. Emma. David had never mentioned anyone named Emma. Caroline's hands shook as she flipped through the other photos. David and Emma at a beach. David and Emma at what looked like a wedding, not their wedding, someone else's. David and Emma in a hospital room. Emma holding a baby. A baby. Caroline sat on the bed, the photographs scattered around her, and tried to breathe. David had a child. He'd had a whole life before her, a life he'd never mentioned, a life he'd erased as completely as if it had never existed. But the clock knew. The clock always knew. She heard the front door open. David calling her name, his voice strained, worried. She didn't move, just sat there with the evidence of his deception literally in her hands. He appeared in the bedroom doorway, saw the photos, went pale. Caroline, who's Emma? I can explain. The clock stopped when you lied to me. It still stopped, so I'm asking you again, and this time I want the truth. Who is Emma? David sank onto the edge of the bed, looking older than his 37 years. She was my wife. Was, past tense. Caroline felt something loosen slightly in her chest, then tighten again as the implication sank in. You were married before? For 3 years. I met her in college, married her right after graduation. We had a daughter, Sophie. She was 6 months old when... His voice broke. When the accident happened. What accident? House fire, 2014. I was at work. They were home. By the time the fire department got there, he couldn't finish. Caroline looked down at the photo of Emma holding a baby, both of them smiling, neither of them knowing they had less than a year left. Why didn't you tell me? Because I couldn't. Because talking about it made it real. Because every time I tried, I felt like I was dying all over again. He looked at her with haunted eyes. I know I should have told you. I know. But we met 3 years after they died. And you were so full of light, so full of life. And I thought if I told you about Emma and Sophie, all you'd see when you looked at me was grief and death and loss. I thought I could have a fresh start. I thought I could be someone who hadn't lost everything. Caroline wanted to be angry. She wanted to rage at him for hiding something so fundamental, for building their marriage on an omission so enormous it had stopped time itself. But when she looked at his face, all she saw was a man who'd been carrying unbearable weight alone. The clock stopped because you lied about working late, she said quietly. Where did you really go? The cemetery. It's Sophie's birthday. She would have been 7 today. I go every year. I put flowers on their graves. And then I come home and pretend I wasn't there. Pretend I don't have a daughter buried in the ground. Pretend I'm not the husband who wasn't home when his family needed him most. You think it's your fault. I know it's my fault. The fire started in the kitchen. Faulty wiring, the inspector said, but I'd been meaning to have an electrician look at it for months. I kept putting it off, kept saying I'd do it next week, next month, and then his voice broke completely now. And then they burned because I couldn't be bothered to fix a problem I knew existed. Caroline set down the photographs and moved closer to him. David, that's not... Don't tell me it wasn't my fault. The clock knows. The clock always knows. I've been lying to you about who I am, about what I've done, about the fact that I'm the reason 2 people are dead. And now, time has stopped for us too. They sat in silence, the weight of revelation pressing down on them. Caroline thought about the clock, about how it had stopped for her father's affair, for the lie about her brother's death, for every significant falsehood spoken in this house over more than a century. And she thought about what her grandmother had told her once, when Caroline was young, and asking why the family kept a clock that punished them for lying. The clock doesn't punish, her grandmother had said. It witnesses. It holds us accountable. And sometimes the only way to move forward is to stop first, to freeze in the moment of deception and face what we've been running from. Come with me, Caroline said, standing up. Where? To the clock. They went downstairs together. The clock stood in the hallway as it always had, silent and still, its hands frozen at 4:17. Caroline stood in front of it and said, You told me you were working late when you were really going to visit your first wife and daughter's graves. That was the lie that stopped the clock. So tell the truth now. Tell it to the clock, to the house, to me, all of it. David looked at the clock, then at Caroline, then back at the clock, and he began to speak. He told her about meeting Emma in a philosophy class junior year, about falling in love slowly, carefully, like 2 people learning a new language, about the wedding in her parents' backyard, small and perfect, about Sophie's birth, how holding his daughter for the first time had been like holding the entire universe in his arms. He told her about the fire, about getting the call at work, about racing home to find the house engulfed, firefighters pulling him back, telling him it was too late, about identifying the bodies, about the funerals, about the months after when he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't feel anything except guilt so profound it was like drowning. He told her about the therapy, the medication, the slow climb back to something resembling function, about selling the house, moving to a new town, trying to start over, about meeting Caroline and feeling for the first time in 3 years like he might be allowed to be happy again, about the decision, conscious, deliberate, to not tell her about Emma and Sophie, to treat his first marriage like it had never happened, to pretend he was meeting Caroline with a clean slate. I told myself it was protecting you, David said, his voice raw. I told myself you didn't need to know. But really, I was protecting myself. Because if I told you, I'd have to admit it happened. I'd have to admit I failed them. I'd have to live with it every day instead of just on Sophie's birthday when I sneak away to put flowers on their graves and cry where no one can see me. He was crying now, openly, his face in his hands. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have told you. I should have trusted you with the truth. Instead, The clock chimed. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5, 17 times total. Then it resumed its steady tick-tock, the pendulum swinging, the hands moving from 4:17 to 4:18. Time had started again. Caroline stared at the clock, then at David. It accepted your truth. I don't understand. It usually stays stopped longer, sometimes days. Maybe, Caroline said slowly, because this wasn't really a lie. It was grief. It was protection. It was trying to survive the worst thing that can happen to a person. The clock has stopped for real lies, betrayals, intentional deceptions. But this was just hurt, trying not to hurt anymore. David looked at her, and in his eyes she saw hope and fear in equal measure. Does this mean you forgive me? I don't know yet, Caroline admitted. You hid something enormous from me. You built our marriage on silence. That's going to take time to process, to understand, to forgive. She reached for his hand. But I understand why you did it. And I'm not leaving. We'll figure this out together. Over the following weeks, David and Caroline went to therapy. They talked, really talked, for the first time about his past, about Emma and Sophie, about how grief doesn't follow a timeline or resolve itself neatly. David showed Caroline more photos, told her stories, slowly integrated his first family into his second life, instead of keeping them sealed away in a drawer. It was hard. Some days Caroline felt like she was competing with a ghost, with a perfect dead wife who would never age or disappoint. Some days David felt like he was betraying Emma by moving on, by letting Caroline into the sacred space where his first family lived in memory. But they kept talking, and the clock kept running. Then, 2 months after the revelation, Caroline came home from work to find David standing in front of the clock, his face ashen. "It stopped again," he said. She looked. The hands were frozen at 2:33 p.m. "What did you lie about?" "I didn't, I swear. I've been here alone all day, working from home. I haven't lied about anything." But the clock didn't lie. The clock never lied. Think, David. Did you tell someone something that wasn't true? Even on the phone? Even in an email? He shook his head, then paused. "I talked to my mother. She asked how we were doing, and I said we were fine." "Are we not fine?" "We are. We're better than fine. We're healing. But," he hesitated. "She asked about you specifically, asked if you were still upset about me not telling you about Emma and Sophie, and I said no. You'd completely forgiven me and moved past it." Caroline felt a chill. "But I haven't completely forgiven you. I'm still processing it. We're still working through it." I know. I just didn't want her to worry. I didn't want her to think I damaged our marriage. So I lied and said everything was perfect." He looked at the clock. "And now, time has stopped again." They stood together in the hallway, looking at the frozen hands. And Caroline thought about how easy it is to lie. How we do it constantly, reflexively, telling people we're fine when we're not, saying everything's okay when it isn't, presenting a polished version of ourselves to the world while the truth writhes beneath the surface. "Call your mother back," Caroline said. "Tell her the truth." David picked up his phone, dialed. "Mom, it's me. Listen, about what I said earlier. Caroline hasn't completely forgiven me. We're working on it. We're in therapy. We're making progress. But it's hard, and it's going to take time, and I shouldn't have pretended otherwise." A pause. "Yes, I know. I'm sorry I lied. I'll talk to you later." He hung up. They waited. The clock remained stopped. "Why didn't that work?" David's voice rose in panic. "I told the truth. I corrected the lie. Why is it still stopped?" Caroline stared at the clock, a thought forming. Maybe because there's another lie, a deeper one you haven't admitted yet. "What are you talking about? I've told you everything." "Have you? Or are you still lying to yourself?" David looked at her, confused and frightened. "Caroline, the fire wasn't your fault," she said quietly. "You keep saying it was. You keep carrying that guilt. But David, faulty wiring isn't your fault. Not calling an electrician sooner isn't the same as setting the fire yourself. You're holding yourself responsible for an accident. I should have protected them. You couldn't have known. You can't predict every disaster. You can't live your life in fear of every possibility. Sometimes terrible things just happen, and it's no one's fault. But if you just what? Been home that day? Then maybe you'd be dead too. If you'd called the electrician, maybe the problem was deeper than anyone could have found. If you'd never met Emma, then Sophie never would have existed at all." Caroline moved closer to him. "You're lying to yourself, David. You're telling yourself you killed them because believing it was your fault is easier than accepting that the universe is random and cruel and sometimes takes away the people we love for no reason at all. You're clinging to guilt because guilt means you had control, means you could have prevented it, means their deaths meant something instead of just being arbitrary tragedy." David's face crumpled. "I don't know how to live with it if it wasn't my fault. At least if I'm guilty, There's a reason. At least if I'm responsible, their deaths make sense. Their deaths don't make sense. They'll never make sense. And that's the truth you've been running from. That's the lie you keep telling yourself. That there's a meaning in meaningless loss. That there's purpose in random pain. David sank to the floor, his back against the wall, and the sound that came from him was barely human. A keening wail of grief that had been held back for 7 years, trapped behind the lie of self-blame, finally breaking free. Caroline sat beside him and held him while he wept for Emma and Sophie, for the family he'd lost, for the randomness of tragedy and the unbearable weight of survival. She held him until the sobbing stopped, until he could breathe again, until he looked up at her with red eyes and said, "I didn't kill them. The fire did. It wasn't my fault." The clock chimed once, then it started running again. But this time, it ran backward. The hands moved counterclockwise, ticking away the seconds in reverse. And Caroline and David watched in shock as the clock unwound itself. 2:32, 2:31, 2:30, faster and faster. The hands spinning backward through the afternoon, through the morning, through the night before. "What's happening?" David whispered. The clock continued its backward journey, days passing in reverse, weeks, months. Caroline saw the hands blur as they raced through time, and she understood with a terrible certainty what was happening. The clock was going back to the beginning, back to the original lie, back to 2014. It stopped at 3:47 a.m. The house went silent. Even the normal sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of settling wood, vanished. Caroline felt like they'd stepped outside time entirely into a space between moments where the rules of reality didn't quite apply. "Why did it stop there?" David asked. Caroline thought about the fire, about when it had happened. "What time did the fire start?" David went pale. 3:47 a.m. That's when the first 911 call came in. That's when he stopped, understanding dawning on his face. "Oh God." "What?" "Emma called 911. I heard the recording during the investigation. She was panicked, said the house was on fire, that she had the baby and was trying to get out. And the operator asked where her husband was, and she said," his voice broke, "she said I was on a business trip, but I wasn't. I was sleeping at the office because we'd had a fight the night before. I'd left angry and hadn't come home. And she lied to protect me, to make it seem like I had a good reason for not being there, like I was a good husband who just happened to be out of town instead of the truth, that I'd walked out after an argument about something stupid that I can't even remember now." Caroline felt her heart break for both of them. She lied for you. Her last words to another person. And she used them to lie for me, to protect my reputation, to make me seem better than I was. And then she died before I could tell her it didn't matter. Before I could tell her I'd rather everyone know the truth and have her alive than have her dead and be remembered as a good husband. "So that's the lie," Caroline said softly. "Not your lie, hers. The lie that's been stopping time all along. Emma saying you were on a business trip when you'd actually left after a fight. That's what needs to be corrected." "But how? She's dead. She can't take it back." Caroline looked at the clock, at its hands frozen at 3:47 a.m., and she thought about what her grandmother had said about the clock witnessing, about holding people accountable, about the only way forward being to stop first. "Tell the truth now," she said. "For Emma, for yourself. Tell what really happened that night." David closed his eyes. "We fought about money. I wanted to invest in a business opportunity. She thought it was too risky. We both said things we shouldn't have. I got angry and said I couldn't stand being in the house, that I needed space. I grabbed my laptop and left, slept on the couch in my office, didn't even text her to say I'd arrived safely. Just left her there with our daughter, angry and alone. And 6 hours later, she was dead. You didn't know the fire would happen?" "No, but I knew I'd hurt her. I knew I'd left our family over something petty and stupid. I knew I'd put my pride above my love for her. He opened his eyes, tears streaming down his face. That's the real truth. Not that I failed to fix the wiring, but that I failed to be there when she needed me. That our last words to each other were angry ones. That she died thinking I might not love her anymore. The clock's hands trembled. Then, slowly, they began to move forward again. 3:48, 3:49, 3:50. But they moved differently now, not with the steady mechanical precision they'd always had, but with something more hesitant, more organic, as if the clock itself was mourning. It moved forward through those terrible hours, through the fire, the 911 call, the arrival of the fire trucks, the moment David's phone had rung with news that would shatter his world. It ticked through the days after, through the funerals and the guilt and the slow dissolution of David's old life. And then it kept going, forward and forward, through the years David had spent alone, through the day he'd met Caroline, through their courtship and marriage, and all the moments he'd tried to pretend his first family had never existed. It reached the present moment, October 15th, 2025, 6:23 p.m., and stopped. Then it chimed. Not the normal hourly chime, but something else. A deeper sound, resonant and somehow final. It chimed once for Emma, once for Sophie, and once for David. 3 chimes for 3 people bound together by love and loss and lies that had finally, after 7 years, been acknowledged and released. After the 3rd chime, the clock resumed its normal rhythm. Tick-tock, tick-tock, steady and sure and somehow more peaceful than Caroline had ever heard it. "It's forgiven me," David whispered. "Or maybe Emma has. I don't know. But something feels lighter." Caroline squeezed his hand. They stood together in front of the clock. 2 people learning how to live with truth instead of running from it. And she thought about how lies work, how they compound and multiply, how one leads to another until you're living in a world constructed entirely of deception, and how the only way back to reality is to stop, to admit what you've been hiding, to face the consequences of your falsehoods. The clock had taught her family that for generations, and now it had taught David. That night, David suggested something he'd never been willing to do before. "I want to show you their house, the one that burned down. It's been rebuilt. A new family lives there now, but I want you to see where they lived, where I lived when I was a different person." They drove to the next town over, to a quiet suburban street. The house was unremarkable, a medium-sized colonial with a nice yard, lights glowing warm in the windows. A family was visible inside, kids running around, parents trying to corral them for bedtime. It was blue before, David said. Emma loved blue. She'd painted every room a different shade. The kitchen was sky blue. Sophie's nursery was periwinkle. Our bedroom was navy. After the fire, they tore it all down and rebuilt. But sometimes I drive by and I can still see it. The blue house. My family inside, like they're ghosts haunting a place that doesn't exist anymore. They're not ghosts, Caroline said gently. They're memories. And memories are allowed to exist. You don't have to hide them anymore. I know. And I won't. I'm going to tell people about them. My coworkers, my friends, anyone who asks about my past. I'm going to say I was married before, that I had a daughter, that I lost them in a fire. I'm going to speak their names out loud instead of keeping them locked away. They'd like that, Caroline said, even though she'd never met them, even though she only knew them through photographs and stories and the grief-shaped hole they'd left in David's life. They drove home, and when they entered the house, the clock was keeping perfect time, and Caroline felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. The kind of peace that comes not from the absence of pain, but from the acceptance of it. But 3 days later, the clock stopped again. This time, Caroline was alone when it happened, mid-morning on a Thursday. And she stood in the hallway, staring at the frozen hands, 10:23 a.m., trying to figure out what lie had just been told. David was at work. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She'd just been moving through the house, doing laundry, cleaning, the mundane tasks of domestic life. So who had lied? Then she realized she had. That morning, her mother had called, had asked how things were going with David, and Caroline had said, "Everything's fine. We worked through it. We're good now." But that wasn't entirely true. They were better. They were healing. But Caroline was still struggling with the revelation that her husband had been married before, that he'd had a whole life she knew nothing about. She was still processing the fact that he'd kept such an enormous secret. She was still sometimes waking up at 3 a.m. wondering what else he might be hiding. She'd lied to her mother because she didn't want to admit she was still hurt, still uncertain, still learning how to trust David again. She'd lied because saying everything was fine was easier than explaining the complicated truth of trying to forgive someone who'd broken your trust, even if they'd done it out of pain rather than malice. The clock knew. The clock always knew. Caroline sat on the stairs and thought about calling her mother back, telling her the truth, correcting the lie. But something stopped her. A question that had been growing in her mind since David's revelation. If the clock stopped for every lie spoken in this house, how did anyone live here? How did her family survive generations with a timepiece that wouldn't tolerate even the smallest falsehood? She thought about her grandmother's words. The clock witnesses. It holds us accountable. But accountable to what standard? Absolute honesty was impossible. Everyone lied, constantly, in ways both large and small. We lie to be polite, to avoid conflict, to protect others, to protect ourselves. We lie because sometimes the truth is too complicated to explain, too painful to speak, too dangerous to reveal. Could you really live in a house that demanded complete honesty at all times? Caroline stood up and walked to the clock. She placed her hand on its wooden case, feeling the silence where there should have been ticking, feeling the weight of all the lies her family had told over more than a century. All the moments time had stopped to bear witness to deception. "I lied to my mother," she said to the clock. "I told her everything was fine when it isn't. I told her David and I were good when we're still figuring it out. And I'm not sorry I lied. Some things are private. Some truths are mine to keep until I'm ready to share them. So I'm not taking it back. I'm not calling her to correct it. This is my lie to tell, and I'm choosing to keep it." The clock remained stopped. Caroline had expected that. What she hadn't expected was what happened next. The glass face of the clock cracked, not shattered, just a single clean line running from top to bottom, splitting the face perfectly in half. Caroline stepped back, her heart racing. In all the family stories, in all the generations of Brennans living with this clock, it had never been damaged. It was supposed to be indestructible, a permanent witness to truth and falsehood. But now, it was broken. And as she watched, the crack began to spread. More lines appeared, webbing across the glass like frost on a window. And the wood case began to warp, and the brass pendulum tarnished in seconds, decades of decay happening in fast forward. The clock was dying. No, not dying. Being released. Caroline understood suddenly that the clock had been bound by its purpose for over a century, trapped in the obligation to witness and judge every lie. And now, she'd done something no one in her family had ever done. She'd refused its judgment. She'd told it that some lies were justified, that absolute truth was neither possible nor desirable, that people needed the freedom to be imperfect, to protect themselves, to choose which truths to share and which to keep private. And in refusing the clock's authority, she'd broken the binding that held it. The clock continued its rapid deterioration. The hands fell off. The gears inside ground to a halt with a sound like a sigh. The wood split and the brass corroded, and within minutes, what had been a beautiful antique timepiece was just ruins. Broken glass and splintered wood and metal turned to rust. Caroline stood in the wreckage, surrounded by the pieces of her family's tradition, and felt something like freedom. When David came home that evening, he found her sweeping up the debris. "What happened?" he asked, staring at the destroyed clock. I broke it." "How?" "I lied and refused to take it back. I told the clock that some lies are okay, that we don't owe absolute truth to everyone, that privacy and self-protection are valid reasons to not speak the whole truth. And the clock couldn't handle it. It broke." David knelt beside the wreckage, picked up a piece of the wooden case. "Your family has had this clock for over a century." "I know. It's been holding your family accountable all that time." "I know. And you destroyed it because you didn't want to apologize for lying to your mother?" Caroline met his eyes. "I destroyed it because I was tired of being held hostage by the idea that truth is always more important than anything else. The clock taught us that lies stop time, that deception has consequences. But it never taught us that sometimes lies are mercy. Sometimes they're protection. Sometimes they're just being human." David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The clock never stopped when I lied to myself about the fire not being my fault. It only stopped when I lied to you. Or when Emma lied to the 911 operator. It judged lies we told to other people, but not lies we told to ourselves." "What does that mean?" "I think it means the clock understood something about human nature, that we need our illusions to survive. That self-deception is a defense mechanism, not a moral failing. The clock only judged us when we deceived others, when we broke trust with another person. But you just lied to your mother to protect your privacy, to avoid explaining something complicated and painful. That's not the same as Emma lying to protect my reputation, or me lying about where I was going. You weren't breaking trust. You were maintaining boundaries." Caroline looked at the broken clock, at the ruins of generations of judgment, and she thought he might be right. Maybe the clock hadn't broken because she'd challenged its authority. Maybe it had broken because its purpose was complete. It had taught the lesson it was built to teach, that lies matter, that deception has consequences, that truth is important. But now it was time to learn the next lesson, that life is more complicated than truth versus lies, that sometimes the right choice isn't clear, that humans need the freedom to be imperfect. They threw away the broken pieces. They patched the hole in the hallway where the clock had stood. They hung a painting there instead, one they chose together, a landscape of mountains and sky, something beautiful and uncomplicated. And time moved on. 3 months later, Caroline discovered she was pregnant. She told David, and they held each other and cried. Tears of joy and fear and hope, and the knowledge that they were bringing a new life into a world that was complicated and painful and beautiful all at once. "What if we mess this up?" David whispered. "What if I fail this child the way I failed Sophie?" "You didn't fail Sophie, and we'll probably mess some things up because all parents do. But we'll love this child, and that's what matters. That's what they'll remember." David pulled back slightly, looked at her face. "I'm terrified." "So am I. But at least now I can tell you that. At least now I don't have to lie and say I'm fine when I'm not." Caroline smiled. "The clock taught us that much, at least." Their daughter, they named her Emma Sophie, honoring both the past and the future, was born in June. She was healthy and loud and demanded attention with the absolute certainty of someone who knew she deserved to be heard. And as Caroline held her daughter for the first time, as David stood beside them looking at his child with wonder and terror and overwhelming love, Caroline thought about truth and lies and time and how we measure a life. The clock had taught them that lies matter, but it had also taught them, through its breaking, through its release, that people matter more, that relationships require more than just truth. They require compassion, understanding, forgiveness, and the wisdom to know when to speak and when to stay silent. Years passed. Emma Sophie grew up in the house without a judgment clock, free to make mistakes, to tell small lies, to learn gradually the difference between deception that harms and deception that protects. She was kind and honest in the ways that mattered, imperfect in the ways that all humans are. And sometimes Caroline would walk past the space where the clock had been, past the painting of mountains and sky, and she'd remember what it had taught her family. She'd remember the sound of time stopping, of silence replacing rhythm, of lies being witnessed and judged. But mostly, she'd remember that the clock had been a tool, not a god, a reminder, not a ruler, and that the most important truth she'd learned was this: we're all lying and truthful, broken and whole, imperfect and trying. And that's not a failure of character, but the definition of being human. The clockmaker's name was Friedrich Brenner, and he died in 1891 without ever knowing if his clocks worked the way he'd intended, if they really could detect lies, or if that was just the fevered dream of a man who'd lost too much to falsehood. And in a small town in Massachusetts, a family lived for generations under the weight of his obsession until one woman finally broke the spell by telling the clock that truth, while important, isn't everything. And now the ruins of that clock sit in a landfill somewhere, still keeping time in their own way, tick-tock, tick-tock, but freed from the burden of judgment. And if you listen very carefully in the space between heartbeats, you might hear them whispering that the greatest truth is this: we are all liars, and we are all honest. We are all guilty, and we are all innocent. And the only way to live with that paradox is to stop trying to measure morality with machinery and start trusting that humans, messy and imperfect as we are, know better than clocks when truth matters and when mercy matters more.